What if I told you that a volcano erupting in 1815 caused teenagers in Europe to become obsessed with vampires, led to the invention of the bicycle, and nearly triggered a civil war in America? Sometimes history's most devastating disasters don't just destroy, they reshape civilization in ways no one can predict. Hey, I'm Michael and welcome to Hoodie History. Today I'm exploring 7 historical disasters that didn't just kill thousands or destroy cities, they fundamentally changed how humanity lives, thinks, and organizes society. These aren't just stories of tragedy and survival, they're about how catastrophes become catalysts, turning devastation into innovation, fear into progress, and chaos into completely new ways of being human. Hoodie History is all about bringing the past to life with new videos dropping regularly. If that sounds good to you, hit subscribe and stick around for more amazing historical tales. By the end of this video, you'll understand why disasters aren't just endings. They're often unexpected beginnings that reshape everything we thought we knew about the world. Let's go. The Black Death, Europe's deadly reset button. So our first disaster takes us to 1347, when Europe was about to experience the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. The Black Death wasn't just a plague, it was a civilization-ending event that killed between 75 and 200 million people, wiping out roughly 60% of Europe's population in just 7 years. But here's what makes this disaster so historically significant. It didn't just kill people, it killed an entire way of life and forced Europe to rebuild from scratch. Before the plague, Europe was locked in a rigid feudal system. Peasants were tied to the land, working for lords who owned everything. Social mobility was basically impossible, and the Catholic Church controlled both spiritual and political power. It was a society built on the idea that God had ordained everyone's place in the hierarchy. Then the plague arrived, probably carried by fleas on rats aboard merchant ships from Asia. Within months, entire villages were empty. Skilled craftsmen, farmers, priests, nobles. The disease didn't care about social rank. Death was suddenly very democratic. And that's when everything changed. With so many people dead, the survivors suddenly had power that they'd never possessed before. Peasants could demand higher wages because there weren't enough workers left. They could choose which lord to work for, or even leave farming entirely to learn new trades in towns. The Catholic Church, which had claimed the plague was God's punishment for sin, lost massive credibility when their prayers didn't stop the dying, and their priests died just as frequently as everyone else. People started questioning religious authority in ways that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. Economically, the plague created Europe's first labor shortage, which led to the invention of labor-saving devices and ultimately sparked technological innovation. Socially, it broke down class barriers and created the first hints of social mobility that would define the modern world. The Black Death was so devastating that it essentially hit Europe's reset button. The world that emerged from the plague's shadow was fundamentally different. The social and economic shifts it caused helped clear the way for the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the beginnings of modern capitalism. I suppose sometimes you have to destroy the old world completely before you can build a new one. The 1755 Lisbon Earthquake, when God's plan stopped making sense. On November 1st, 1755, which was also All Saints' Day, when churches across Portugal were packed with worshippers, a massive earthquake struck Lisbon. The 8.5 magnitude earthquake was followed by fires that burned for days, and a tsunami that swept away everything the earthquake and fires had missed. But this wasn't just another natural disaster. The Lisbon earthquake shattered something more fundamental than buildings. It broke European faith in divine providence and sparked the Enlightenment's most important philosophical revolution. You see, 18th century Europeans believed in something called theodicy, the idea that God was all good, all powerful, and that everything happened for a reason. Even disasters were part of God's perfect plan. This was the philosophical foundation of European society. Then Lisbon happened. Why would a loving God destroy churches full of faithful worshippers on one of the holiest days of the year? Why did the brothels in the red light district survive while cathedrals collapsed? If this was God's plan, what kind of God were they worshipping? The physical earthquake hit Europe's intellectual community like a philosophical earthquake. Voltaire wrote Candide, savagely mocking the idea that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. Kant developed his philosophy partly as a response to Lisbon, arguing that human reason, not divine revelation, should guide society. The disaster sparked what historians call the secularization of European thought. If God's plan didn't make sense, maybe humans needed to take responsibility for creating a rational, just society themselves. This led directly to ideas about human rights, democratic government, and scientific progress that would fuel the American and French revolutions. The Lisbon earthquake didn't just destroy a city, it destroyed the philosophical foundations of the old world and helped create the intellectual framework of the modern world. Sometimes a single disaster can shake more than the ground. It can shake the very foundations of how humans understand reality. The 1815 Mount Tambora eruption, the volcano that changed culture. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with such a force that it made modern disasters look like fireworks. The explosion was heard 1,200 miles away, and the volcano spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that it literally changed the weather around the world. 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Temperatures dropped by several degrees globally. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Snow fell in June in the northeastern United States. Famine struck from Ireland to China. But here's where this disaster gets even more interesting. The climate chaos sparked a cultural revolution that's still shaping us today. In Switzerland, the unusually cold, wet summer trapped a group of English writers indoors. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and John Polidori found themselves stuck inside during what should have been beautiful summer weather. To pass time, they decided to have a ghost story contest. That contest produced Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and The Vampire by Polidori, essentially creating the modern horror genre and our entire cultural obsession with vampires and monsters. The Gothic literature movement that followed would influence everything from Edgar Allan Poe to modern horror movies. Meanwhile, the crop failures and transportation chaos in Germany led Baron Karl Drais to invent the running machine, the precursor to the bicycle. Because horses were too expensive to feed during the famine, the bicycle would eventually revolutionize transportation and women's liberation. In America, the failed harvests in New England drove thousands of farmers westward, accelerating westward expansion and intensifying debates about slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The eruption even influenced art. The spectacular sunsets caused by volcanic particles in the atmosphere inspired Turner's paintings and may have influenced the Romantic movement's obsession with sublime, overwhelming natural forces. A single volcanic eruption in Indonesia created Frankenstein, vampires, bicycles, accelerated American expansion, and helped spark Romanticism. Sometimes the butterfly effect isn't a metaphor, it's geological. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, building the modern city. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was jolted awake by one of the most powerful earthquakes in American history. But it wasn't the shaking that destroyed the city, it was the fires that followed, burning for 3 days and consuming over 80% of San Francisco. The disaster was catastrophic. Over 3,000 people died, and 250,000 were left homeless. But San Francisco's response to the earthquake would revolutionize how we build cities and respond to disasters. Before 1906, American cities were essentially fire traps. Buildings were made of wood, fire departments were underfunded, and broad-scale city planning was basically non-existent. The San Francisco fires showed just how vulnerable urban areas really were. But instead of just rebuilding the same vulnerable city, San Francisco decided to build something better. They implemented the first comprehensive city planning in American history, with wider streets, better water systems, and fire-resistant building codes. The earthquake also revealed massive corruption in city government. Emergency supplies disappeared, insurance companies tried to avoid paying claims, and officials embezzled relief funds. The public outrage led to the first major urban reform movement in American history. More importantly, the disaster proved that rapid, large-scale urban reconstruction was possible. The techniques developed to rebuild San Francisco quickly and efficiently became the model for 20th century urban development. The city that rose from the ashes was essentially the prototype for the modern American city. The earthquake also changed how America responds to disasters. It was the first time the federal government provided large-scale disaster relief, establishing precedents that would eventually lead to FEMA and modern emergency management systems. San Francisco's rebuilding proved that disasters could be opportunities to build back better, not just build back. The city that emerged was safer, more beautiful, and more efficiently organized than the one that burned. It was proof that catastrophe could become catalyst. The 1918 flu pandemic, the invisible enemy. Between 1918 and 1919, a flu pandemic swept across the globe, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, more than World War I, which was happening at the same time. But this wasn't just a medical disaster, it was a social revolution that changed how we live in communities. The 1918 flu was especially terrifying because it killed healthy young adults, not just the elderly and weak. Entire families would be wiped out in days. Cities became ghost towns as people avoided all social contact. But here's what makes this pandemic historically transformative. It forced humanity to completely rethink public health and government responsibility for citizen welfare. Before 1918, public health was mostly a matter of personal responsibility. Governments didn't think they had an obligation to protect people from disease. Medical care was private, and if you couldn't afford it, that was your problem. The flu pandemic changed all of that. Governments realized that infectious diseases were national security threats that required coordinated, large-scale responses. You couldn't just tell people to take care of themselves when a virus could destroy entire societies. Cities started implementing the first modern public health measures: mask mandates, social distancing, business closures, and quarantine systems. These weren't just temporary emergency measures, they became permanent parts of how governments manage public health. The pandemic also accelerated medical research and professionalized medicine. Before 1918, medical training was inconsistent, and many doctors had no real scientific education. The crisis forced rapid improvements in medical education, research funding, and healthcare delivery. Socially, the pandemic broke down many traditional barriers. With so many men dying or at war, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Traditional social hierarchies collapsed when survival became the only priority. The 1918 flu essentially created the modern concept of public health and established the principle that governments have a responsibility to protect citizens from health threats. It laid the groundwork for the welfare state, national healthcare systems, and the entire field of epidemiology. The Irish Potato Famine: How Hunger Scattered a Nation. Between 1845 and 1852, a potato disease called late blight devastated Ireland's primary food source, causing what became known as the Irish Potato Famine. Over 1 million people died, and another million emigrated, reducing Ireland's population by 25%. But this wasn't just a famine, it was the disaster that created the Irish diaspora and fundamentally changed the cultural landscape of the English-speaking world. The famine revealed the brutal realities of British colonial rule in Ireland. While Irish people were starving, Ireland was still exporting food to England. The British government's response was inadequate and often cruel, viewing the famine as God's way of solving the Irish problem. This wasn't just simple cruelty, it was driven by a rigid commitment to laissez-faire economics. The British government believed that interfering with the free market, for instance by banning food exports from a starving country, was fundamentally wrong. They were trapped by an ideology that made effective action impossible. This callous response radicalized Irish nationalism and planted the seeds for the independence movement that would eventually create the Irish Republic. The famine became the foundational trauma that unified Irish identity around resistance to British rule. But the global impact came through emigration. Desperate Irish families fled to America, Canada, Australia, and anywhere else that would take them. These weren't just refugees, they were the founders of Irish communities that would transform their new countries. In America, Irish immigrants faced massive discrimination but eventually became a powerful political force. They built the political machines that controlled major cities, provided crucial labor for industrialization, and created distinctly Irish-American cultural institutions. The Irish diaspora didn't just transplant Irish culture, it created entirely new hybrid cultures. Irish-American music influenced country, folk, and rock music. Irish political traditions shaped American urban politics. Irish Catholic institutions became major forces in American education and social services. The famine also changed how the world thought about hunger and government responsibility. It was one of the first disasters extensively covered by international media, creating the modern concept of humanitarian crisis that requires global response. What started as a crop disease in one small island ended up scattering Irish culture across the globe and creating influential Irish communities that shaped politics, culture, and identity of multiple nations. Sometimes a disaster doesn't just change where it happens, it changes everywhere its survivors go. The 1935 Black Sunday dust storm, when nature fought back. On April 14, 1935, a massive dust storm engulfed the American Great Plains, creating a wall of dirt over 1,000 miles wide and 200 miles long. The storm was so intense it turned day into night and carried topsoil from Colorado all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Black Sunday was the climax of the Dust Bowl, a decade-long environmental disaster that turned America's breadbasket into a wasteland. But this wasn't just a natural disaster, it was the direct result of human environmental destruction, and it prompted America to completely rethink its relationship with nature. For decades, farmers had been ripping up the native prairie grasses that held the Great Plains soil together, replacing them with wheat and corn. When drought hit in the 1930s, there was nothing to keep the topsoil from literally blowing away. The dust storms were apocalyptic. Families hung wet sheets over windows and doors to try to keep the dirt out, but it still got into everything: food, water, and lungs. Children and elderly people died from dust pneumonia. Entire farms were buried under drifting soil. But Black Sunday did more than destroy farms. It destroyed Americans' faith in unlimited expansion and environmental exploitation. The disaster helped Americans realize that their actions could literally destroy the land that sustained them. The Dust Bowl sparked the first major environmental movement in American history. The federal government created the Soil Conservation Service, introduced scientific farming techniques, and began the first large-scale environmental restoration projects. The disaster also accelerated one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Dust Bowl refugees, immortalized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, fled to California and other western states, changing the demographics and culture of the entire American West. The environmental consciousness that emerged from the Dust Bowl would eventually lead to Earth Day, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the modern environmental movement. Black Sunday taught America and the world that there are consequences for treating the environment as an enemy to be conquered rather than a partner to be respected. 7 disasters spanning 7 centuries, from medieval plague to modern environmental catastrophe. Each one proves that history's most devastating moments often become its most transformative ones. What fascinates me about these stories is how they show that human beings are incredibly adaptive, but only when forced to be. It can take a catastrophe to make us question our assumptions, challenge our systems, and imagine better ways of living. The Black Death destroyed feudalism and created the Renaissance. The Lisbon Earthquake shattered religious certainty and sparked the Enlightenment. A volcanic eruption created Frankenstein and the bicycle. An earthquake rebuilt how we construct cities. A pandemic established public health systems. A famine scattered Irish culture across the globe. And a dust storm taught us to respect the environment. Each disaster forced humanity to evolve, not just to survive, but to become something better than what we were before. That's maybe the most hopeful lesson from history's darkest chapters. Human beings don't just endure catastrophe, we use it to reinvent ourselves. History suggests that our best transformations come from our worst moments, if we're brave enough to embrace change instead of just mourning what we've lost. So which of these disasters surprised you the most? Did you know that a volcanic eruption created vampire literature? Were you shocked by how the Irish famine shaped multiple continents? And after learning how disasters repeatedly transformed civilization, do you feel more hopeful or more worried about our current global challenges? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if there are other catastrophic game changers you think deserve exploration. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. And one last thing, if you're interested in shorter stories from history, I publish content frequently on my other channel, Hoodie History Shorts. You can check it out now to discover all kinds of punchy stories from history. There's a link here and in the video description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember that sometimes the worst moments in history become the turning points that change everything for the better.